everyone and welcome back to my channel. This is Colleen with Colleen Cosplay, and I will be doing a tutorial on my very large, heavy, majestic Supergirl cape. And I patterned this all myself, so I'm going to walk you through that as well. To start with the pattern, you're gonna need the neckline. And you can get this from any pattern that has a neckline, from a t-shirt you already own. You can freehand it if you're comfortable enough. I took the neckline from my Batgirl cape pattern. You only need about half of it, at least at this step. And I do my patterning on wrapping paper because it's easy to get a lot of it. Now that I have my neckline, you're gonna decide how long you want your cape to be. My cape ended up being 50 inches long. It went to about mid-calf, and I am 5'7" in height. So you're gonna take that distance, say it is the 50 inches, and you're going to make a circle with a constant radius around that neckline. So I'm going to fold this then, and I actually ended up doing a third of a cape. You can do a half of a cape, a fourth, fold it however much you need to fit on the width of fabric that you have purchased. I also did the patterning for the shoulder drape part. The only way I could figure it out was by actually getting some spare fabric and doing a mock-up. And the way you're gonna do this is you're gonna start with a shape that you think is kinda close. Obviously the neckline is gonna follow your same neckline. Because it is holding up so much weight, it doesn't really drape very well on its own, so you're going to have to use a gathering stitch to create that effect. So on my mock-up, I'm doing a gathering stitch on the edges, and then I'm going to gather it up and see how it looks. Now with my mock-up, I am going to take the shoulder part, and I'm going to pin it to the shoulder seam of my t-shirt, and the part that clasps in the front, I'm going to pin to the center. And I'm going to do this again, and again, and again, until I finally create a pattern that when I pin it to the shoulder seam and to the center of my t-shirt, it drapes nicely like it does in the reference photos. Keep in mind, this won't drape the same way when it's holding up the weight of the cape. And when you get to attaching it to the cape, you can do a little bit of fitting and it'll work out just fine. And I'm going to cut everything out. I used about 6 yards of fabric. This is the Yayahan cosplay fabric. It was on a huge sale at Joann's, otherwise I never would have been able to justify the cost for this cape. Since I did my cape pattern in thirds, I'm going to cut out 3 of that pattern, and then I also wanted to line the cape, so I cut out another 3. And if you can't cut it out on a fold, that is just fine. Cut it out not on a fold and you'll sew them together later. It is nice if you can get them to fit across from each other, and you can fit them side by side on your fabric. We're also going to cut out the applique that is going to go on the back of the cape. I got this design from her character design. I enlarged it in Microsoft Word and then printed it out, and I'm going to use this as my template. And I'm using this yellow spandex. It was a lot thinner than I would have liked and a little sheer, so I'm double layering it. This will make it harder to applique, but it looks a lot nicer. I'm also going to use a fabric pen, which will come out under an iron, and that's going to help mark the symbol so that I can cut it out easier. You're gonna wanna attach this applique before you sew any other part of the cape together. And I'm gonna go over the applique process. I also have a separate tutorial out, and I will link that in the description down below. Since this is a more complicated applique design, I'm going to go over it again in this tutorial. To start out, you're gonna wanna use a tearaway stabilizer. And to this stabilizer, I'm going to use this spray. This is going to stick your applique onto your stabilizer. And then I'm going to use a zigzag stitch and just sew around the outside border of my symbol. What this is going to do is it's going to hold the 2 layers of fabric together. This is also going to sew those 2 layers onto the stabilizer, which is going to make the outer border a lot thicker and more stable. This will also be covered up by the applique stitch later. Now that I have that zigzag stitch going around the border, I'm going to cut it out. Everything else can be torn away or cut away. Now we can put our symbol onto the cape. Make sure you have enough seam allowance on either side of the symbol to sew this to the other parts of the cape. I'm going to be using an applique stitch or a very tight zigzag stitch. and I'm gonna have it fairly wide for the outside border. Taking corners is not quite as hard as taking curves, so you can use a larger applique stitch. Smaller stitches will help you with sharp turns and corners. The key thing to a nice smooth applique stitch is having a steady acceleration. And if you're gonna speed up or slow down, do it slowly. For sewing corners, there are some other things you have to take into consideration. You can see that the position of the needle when you make a turn matters. One will leave an opening and another will double up on that corner. You want the second option. So you're gonna wanna turn when the needle is furthest away from that corner, and always turn with the needle down in the fabric. And for taking corners, you also want to overshoot by half of your stitch width. This will give you space for when you turn to have that wider stitch length and not have any bumps in the corner. Now I'm moving on to the smaller shapes in the center of the symbol. I'm going to use a smaller applique stitch for this because this will be a lot easier to turn and maneuver. When taking sharp turns with an applique stitch, don't pick up the foot in the middle of the turn. It'll leave a bump in the applique stitching. So you want to be able to turn the fabric before you even hit the curve, because it'll take a lot more time for it to turn than it would if it was doing something like a simple zigzag stitch, since it is doing so many stitches. With applique stitching, you should also have the pressure on your sewing machine foot set to a lower setting. If it is at a higher setting, then it'll cause the applique to wrinkle and it'll be hard to get it to lay flat. Now that you have the entire applique done, you can just tear away that tearaway stabilizer on the back, and then you can use a ripper to pull off the stabilizer in the center areas of the design. Now with the applique out of the way, we can start sewing the cape together. You're going to take all your cape pieces that were cut not on the fold, and you're going to sew that straight seam together, so as if they were cut on the fold. And I'm going to serge that seam as well. Now I can sew the pieces together. Since my cape was done in thirds, I will sew all the thirds together for the outer layer and for the lining. And I will serge this as well. Now I have my outer layer and my lining done. We are going to sew them together later, but first I'm going to get the shoulder drape done. So using that pattern that we made from the mock-up at the start, I'm going to cut those out, and then I'm going to do the gathering stitch. This is actually done the same way you would do ruffles. So you're going to do a gathering stitch along the top. This is a very wide straight stitch, and you're going to leave a lot of thread loose on each end so you can pull it tight. And I'm gonna do two of these, one close to the other but never crossing each other. And then you can take some of the long pieces of thread on either side and pull them. And this will gather the fabric in between as you are pulling the thread tight. Now you can sew your shoulder drape onto your cape, and you're just gonna sew right over all of your gathered stitching. At this point, we can do the fitting that I was talking about earlier. There was this loose, puffy region where there was extra fabric, so I'm going to take that in and seam together that piece. And I'm going to do this for the outer layer and for the lining, since I also have the shoulder drape portion lined as well. Now we can attach our outside layer to our lining. And I'm going to start doing this by attaching the front clasping portion of the shoulder drape. So I'm going to sew together the neckline portion of the lining to the outer layer, right sides together. And then I'm going to do some very long seams around the outside of the cape. So sew all the way around the cape except for your opening that you're going to use to turn it inside out. For me, that opening was in one of the bottom corners. And once you've done this, then you can hand sew that opening shut. I'm going to top stitch around the entire outside border of the cape. This includes the entire cape and both of the shoulder drapes. A top stitch is just the straight stitch that you're gonna do around the entire edge, and this keeps the edges flat. To finish this off, I'm going to use these very large hook and eyes, and I'm going to hand sew them onto the clasp at the front. So go out and make your own super majestic, very full and heavy cape. And I would also like to thank my sewing sensei for letting me use her place for this project. My normal sewing workstation is way too small to accommodate this size and amount of fabric. She let me use her sewing room, her machine, and all her equipment for this particular project, so thank you for that. And thank you to all of you guys as well for watching, and I will see you in the next video.